Children around the world have stayed away from school to lead what could be the biggest day of protest yet against climate change.
At noon, a massive climate march is underway right now in San Francisco.
From Australia to Iceland.
In Britain, they answered in astonishing numbers.
Nothing is true and everything is possible.
On the 20th of September 2019, we were in Austin, Texas. It was the first day of our 6-week American tour, and it was also the day of the global climate strike. 4 million people across 150 countries gathered worldwide. It was likely the largest climate protest in world history. We went down to the mass gathering in Austin, which was abuzz with the spirit and determination of the next generation.
So we got to watch so many great speakers that day, and I was filming them on my phone. And one of the speakers was a student called Grace Meinzer.
I will no longer be apathetic as our society refuses to truly act on the climate crisis.
And I remember once she finished her speech, it had a real rousing conclusion to it. And we all just looked at each other and we didn't need to say anything. We knew immediately, right there and then, that speech would become the introduction to our set for the rest of that tour.
I will empower myself and empower others by not turning a blind eye to the science and the data that backs climate change. I am 17 years old. I am standing on this stage today fighting for
So after years and years of failure, really, in climate activism, there's been such a lack of action on climate change over the last few years. We felt deflated. I'm sure many of you watching this felt deflated. And to see the sheer intelligence and eloquence of some of these young speakers and the passion and the fortitude, it was so energizing for us. We felt completely revitalized and kind of impassioned. And we immediately knew that we needed to get into the studio as soon as possible and kind of bottle this energy. And it just so happened that the day before the first day of tour, so literally the day we arrived in America, we met a young studio engineer.
And then we got to America, and at the beginning of every tour, we do a big inventory of all our equipment and everything we need to buy, our replacements for the start of that tour. And we were in a music shop in Dallas, Texas.
Got chatting to the guy behind the counter. He's saying, are you guys Australian? Are you guys a band? All the normal questions. And then he mentioned that he had a studio that he worked at just down the road. So if we ever wanted to come there, I think he just meant it as a passing comment. But we were like,
And so after the climate march, we felt so inspired that straight away we called up the guy and we booked into his studio the following day.
All right, day 2 of our American tour. We played Austin, Texas last night. We're now in Dallas. We're about to go and record some vocals at, what was it?
All Access.
All Access Studios. We're going to do some stuff for Crossing the Rubicon.
I'm hungover. Me and Chris just stayed up chatting till 4:30.
Oh wow.
Which is 10 a.m. UK time or something ridiculous like that. Always first show of the tour that you go over the top.
I didn't.
Alright.
It worked really well. It was this great studio, and there was this the music was so sort of exciting to us because it was in the middle of the demoing process, and suddenly we were in this nice studio. So that kind of energy and excitement was really fresh, and I think it came out in his vocals. You can hear that within the recording of Raoul's vocals. It gives it a little lick, which I think is really nice.
Something's got to give. Come too far to come back. Something's got to give now. Come too far to turn back. Something's got to give.
Sounding a lot better. Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I really like that little couple of times you did a little lick on the end of something's got to give. Really sounded nice. Yeah.
So as we looked at with The Great Unknown, as a species, we now have such immense technological power that we actually threaten our own very existence. So nuclear weapons is the obvious example of this, or the first example. But it's very clear there are now other ways in which we threaten ourselves too. Over the last few hundred years, our fossil fuel powered lifestyle, along with our economic incentives for short-term thinking, for self-interest, for infinite growth, these have all set us on a very destructive and risky path indeed. We have now entered a new age, the Anthropocene.
So this term, the Anthropocene, is a really good one. It really well describes this really extensive influence that we as a society have had on the planet. You know, everywhere you look over our entire Earth system, you can see the fingerprints of our actions, whether that's, you know, the climate change signal, deforestation, impacts in terms of ocean pollution, land use change, everything. So, you know, really we are everywhere influencing the system of the planet that we live on now.
We invented a technology which has been incredibly useful for society to develop. You know, the steam engine kick-started the Industrial Revolution and we've gained so much from that. But we're now seeing the side effects of that development and that technology, which were unforeseen at the time, but are now having very large effects across the planet. We've seen glaciers melt, we've seen sea levels rise as the oceans warm and expand, and we've seen changes in the natural world across the planet. And these are all signs that the planet is warming. They're unmistakable signs.
There's, of course, a window for influence and action to prevent catastrophic climate change, but that window closes a little more with each year of inaction and with each year of business as usual. So, according to the latest estimates, without revolutionary action to reduce our emissions, we'd be on course for a global temperature rise of anything from 3 to 5 degrees Celsius this century. And that may kind of set us on course to a global tipping point, which is where the Earth systems as we know them today tip over into a completely new state.
The world systems, our life support systems, are incredibly complex and we scarcely understand them. What you can say is that there are certain signs we get, which scientists describe as flickering, which suggests that those systems could be in serious trouble and could be about to tip. In other words, they could be about to cross their crucial thresholds, after which they effectively collapse. Among the complex systems are the world's climate, the world's oceans, the world's soils, the world's ecosystems. And all of them are sending distress signals. All of them are flickering, sending signals that their functions are beginning to break down. And they're beginning to break down because we're disrupting them to an extraordinary degree.
There's the crises that we're seeing in the Earth system as a result of our relationship to it and the fact that we're kind of destabilizing these planetary systems, these ecosystems, you know, whether it's the Arctic or the Amazon. We can see that we're pushing these natural ecosystems to these tipping points where those systems could end up shifting out of the equilibrium that they were in for hundreds and thousands of years into a kind of a new state. And so this is what we're seeing with all these different subsystems, that they're all kind of, we're pushing them to the edge, and they could go into this state, which a lot of scientists say is going to make it much more difficult for human beings to survive. It kind of reduces, they call it the safe operating space, reduces the safe the kind of the livability and survivability of the habitat that we're on.
We've been living in this incredibly fortunate era since the last glaciation, last 12,000 years or so, where the climate, the conditions on Earth have been really benign. They've been very stable. And we've been in a benign, stable period, which we're in grave danger of tipping over into a hostile, stable period. If we push these systems past their tipping points, they don't come back. When it happens, it's like removing a little pebble which is stopping a boulder from rolling down a hill. And we are far too small and far too weak to push that boulder back up the hill.
This tipping point, you know, this point of no return. This is what the phrase crossing the Rubicon means.
For some time, Julius Caesar's power had been growing at a rate that alarmed the Roman Senate. In 49 BC, the Senate, led by Caesar's biggest rival, Pompey the Great, ordered Caesar to relinquish his command. Not wanting to forfeit his power to his enemies in Rome, Caesar instead made the decision to bring his army across the Rubicon River. Now that doesn't sound like much of a drastic step, but this river was then a northern boundary of Italy. And by bringing his 13th legion across it, in the direction of Rome, Caesar was actually making a declaration of war. The phrase crossing the Rubicon has survived over the centuries to refer to any individual or group who commits to a risky, revolutionary, and unalterable course of action.
It's funny because, like, progressive politics is often presented as, like, you know, radical or extreme. Whereas if you think about it, especially in terms of ecology and social stability, it's actually this current path we're on. It's actually business as usual that's extreme. Our archaic energy infrastructure and our obsession with infinite growth, that's the extremity. That's what's causing the most damage and death and will continue to do so. So really, we have to cross our own Rubicon. We have to be bold and unrelenting in our activism. We have to demand revolutionary change. We have to rethink, reimagine, redesign our infrastructure and our world.
So we all came away from the climate strike feeling immensely inspired, and we wanted to write something that portrayed the strength and determination that we witnessed there. So we started writing a bass line, and we wanted the bass line to be bold and strong and emboldening, and something that could act as the backbone of the song.
So being that we try to encourage progressive thought and action, we also try to represent that within the recording techniques that we use in the studio. For the snare sound, I layered up 2 different snares, literally one small one sat on top of another one, both being mic'd. And together they really created a very unique sound that I don't think you'd hear anywhere else. I remember, I swear it was in the studio, and you were just sitting quietly in the corner, and I heard coming out, and I was like, is he doing what I think he's doing? I think he is.
I think it was one of you guys' suggestion, because I can remember I had the Labyrinth lyric, but I'd never even thought that, we have a song called Labyrinth. Nostalgia's like immensely a powerful thing with the music, and like, you know how like films are constantly referencing older films, you know, to be cool, and like, we referenced that film in this shot, in this scene. And like, you get that a lot in pop music as well. The writers reference older pop music, you know, like, that guitar is actually from a Michael Jackson track or whatever.
And we keep referencing ourselves. But that's something that we really enjoy doing. We enjoy referencing ourselves. It's always nice to reference our past. It really shows that we know who we are, our journey, and the point that we're at, we've only got to by the places that we've been.
So Crossing the Rubicon became this really emboldening track. You know, it's all about positivity and determination. But I wanted to address the climate and biodiversity emergency overtly as well, because every single album of ours has had 1 or 2 tracks that addresses climate change and the destruction of the natural world. You know, go back to the first album, there was Mothership, Johnny Sniper, and then No Sleep Tonight, Myopia, Arguing with Thermometers. So I'd come at this subject from lots of different angles over the years. With this album, I got to the point where I was just like, what more can I say? Like, how else can I approach this subject? I sort of felt too angry and fed up and fatigued and hoarse to address this subject, you know, to sing about this subject, I guess. And so I thought what I'd do is I'd tell the same story of Warning, but this time tell it purely through music, through instrumental music. I'd wanted to write an orchestral piece for years. Like, you know, I played the trumpet was the first instrument I learned. I've written for brass, for strings, for woodwind, sort of individually, but I'd never taken on the full daunting majesty of an orchestra. And I thought that writing a piece about basically the story of life on our planet and the perils of human interference felt like a suitable, albeit ambitious, place to start.
I met Raoul. He sort of said to me that he liked the idea of doing film music. I subsequently listened to their stuff, and I thought that he has a very good sense of theatre. And I was interested in them. I went to see them do a gig. They're very, very creative and very musical. They're accomplished, you know. I mean, I couldn't define really what they are, but I like the mix of what they are, the kind of influences that they have, and they're almost post everything. You know, there seems to be so many things that they embrace in their style, and yet they manage to make it their own thing.
So I'd written this piece, but I was quite anxious about it, having never worked with a full orchestra before. So I took the piece to George Fenton, who's one of my favourite modern day composers. I mean, George is an incredibly accomplished composer, but specifically he's written so much for the natural world, so to speak. So like he did all the soundtracks for the BBC Natural History series, Blue Planet, Planet Earth, Frozen Planet. So I thought he would be the perfect person to go to try and make this track a reality. And with him at my side, I felt a lot more comfortable taking on a 90-piece orchestra, you know, like 90 musicians who are far better trained than I.
It must have been 6 or 8 months later, he wrote and said, I've got this track I'm writing. Can you have a listen to it? I was very, very impressed by the track. And I think that because of what he was writing it about, it kind of seemed that he was just saying something in an orchestral context. And I thought that was a good context to say what he was saying.
So we head to Prague in just 2 days, and George has just sent through what I hope is the last edit of the music. This is the MIDI session. Sounds pretty funny. It sounds much better when we record it. And he's also just sent through the score, which is just beautiful and quite surreal, actually, seeing it all together in one place. Really excited. Feeling good. Tomorrow morning, bright and early, 8 a.m. Magic happens.
We went to Prague to record. They did a really good job there. The studio was great. A lot of film music gets recorded in Prague. What it was on the chart was quite difficult to play, actually.
Some of the parts are pretty testing. For example, like one of the first violin parts, I mean, it's not an ostinato. It's a riff, it's a lick, it's a guitar lick really. It's diddle-diddle-dit, diddle-diddle-dit, diddle-diddle-dit. It just repeats that for 2 minutes. I mean, that is an exercise for your finger muscles, basically. And I remember on the day, like one of the violinists just like giving me a quite an evil, you know, the side eye, like. I was just like, sorry, it's for the greater good, for the greater good.
What I think is great is that he creates the order, but with this incredible busyness and overlapping, so that you feel the great sense of activity, and yet it's very structured.
My name is Tanya, I'm translator, session assistant.
I'm George Fenton. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
How you doing?
Hi, nice
Lovely
to
to meet
meet
you. I was so nervous. It's all pretty surreal.
So effectively, Elegy is what's referred to as a piece of program music. So it's trying to convey a story or an event or something in the real world by purely using instruments. So I do this by starting with some kind of sprightly, fiddly, but kind of fragile violins, which are supposed to mimic the birth of life on our planet. So, you know, the microbial life, the beginnings of life on Earth. And they're quickly joined by all sorts of little flutters and flurries from a broad range of instruments that represent the variety of life as it got started on Earth. You know, each new instrument conveys the arrival of multitudes of weird and wonderful creatures. And then we enter the march section of the piece, and a march tempo and rhythm and pace is typical for classical music, and I'm using it here to represent the march of life, the Cambrian explosion, the blossoming of the evolutionary tree. And then at 2 minutes and 22 seconds, the opening chorale theme returns, and it's bold and it's celebratory, and that's because we have the birth of humanity. This is the birth of the first species that is able to contemplate this very story of evolution, the first species that can understand and communicate complexity, the first species that can contemplate itself. And then we all know what happens next.
There's a development section musically which leads ultimately to the collapse of everything.
last section of the piece represents the Industrial Revolution and then the Anthropocene. So it represents the rise in greenhouse gas emissions. It represents the rising sea levels. It represents that since 1970, 68% of mammal, bird, fish, and reptile populations have been wiped out. It represents this immense biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. We hear the panicking of wildlife populations in the screaming, dissonant violins. The menacing blasts on the brass and double basses resemble humanity's terrifying technological power. It represents our vandalism, our butchery, our exploitation of the natural world. And the piece basically ends with existential catastrophe. All musical harmony disappears, and the piece descends into complete dissonance and death.
Beautiful.
Christ, I need a drink.
The collapse of everything becomes musically satisfying. Within the context of the piece, the collapse is an intrinsic part of the music, so that it speaks as a piece of music, but it also tells the story where the ending is totally unsatisfying, but it manages to do it in a way that makes sense of the music. In some ways, you could characterize the situation as the planet itself being pitted against us, the human race. We're like a rogue cell at the moment in the story of this planet. You know, whether we can heal that ourselves and by protecting the planet, protect our future, I think that would be a win-win. Whether or not we have the sense ultimately to do that is the big question, and I think the proposition Rao makes in Elegy is currently bang on.
To me, Elegy for Extinction is a reason to fight for life on our planet. It really shows the colour, the vibrance, the wealth of life, the beauty of it all, and the sadness of if it was all to be lost, and which we're losing more and more of it every day. And this song brings to life that tragedy, but through showing its beauty.
We have solutions available to us.
And we can stop it. I think there's still time to stop it. It's probably the case that the people alive today are the last people who will ever be alive on Earth who have that opportunity to stop it. If we don't do it, it's highly likely to become unstoppable, and it's highly likely that future generations won't have anything they can do about it at all.
Yeah, so our generation certainly has an enormous responsibility right at this moment. All of the choices we make from now on over the next 2, 3, 4 decades will have consequences across the planet. Every bit of warming makes the situation worse in terms of the impacts on human society and ecosystems. But yes, every decision matters at this moment.
I'm so pleased to see this generation kind of picking up and doing more than the generation that we're part of was doing. I'm really proud to see what the young people are doing, and I really hope that they get as much support as they deserve from the older generation. They definitely have my support. They have a lot of my colleagues' support in terms of what they're doing and just shaking up things and trying to get things to change. I know people will call them kind of naive, or they'll criticize them for, turning up at the thing in a car or something like that. And I think that's really reductive and really silly. Young people have to try and dream bigger than what we've kind of given them. More power to them.
I have a lot of faith in us. That may be naive, but I do, especially the younger generations. The younger generations have grown up in an entirely different world. They see the world through a completely different lens. They have no ownership of this, disaster, this developing disaster. They only have legitimate fury and righteous indignation. And that fuels, the demand for justice and the demand for a new world. So I'm excited. I'm excited about what you can achieve. And I'm excited about what we can achieve together.
In these first 2 episodes, we've looked at some of the ways in which humanity is now risking its own long-term stability and survival. In episode 3, we're going to look at our current hostile social atmosphere, something that can only make our existential risks more difficult to manage and address. We'll look at the state of social trust, empathy and compassion, and even truth itself.